Slice the Podcast is brought to you by Vagalend, a different way to get a mortgage. Vagalend provides insight and advice so you can make informed decisions for the future of your family. Welcome to Slice, Property Made Possible. We're a platform on a mission to reduce barriers to home ownership. This podcast is a safe space for our community to learn together and build the confidence required to start on their property journey. When you're ready to start, head along to slicetobuy.com and sign up for your free dashboard. We're a platform on a mission.
Welcome back to Between Two Ferns.
Yes, I'm Zach Galifianakis.
And I'm Steve Carell.
Steve, oh, like that one.
Yeah.
Good from you.
Punchy.
We want it. No, kidding, guys. We're up to episode 9.
Episode 9.
We're reviewing some documents now, some pretty important ones. This is very much your lane, Amy, isn't it? I'm excited.
I mean, yeah, it's getting into the nuts and bolts of, what is a pretty hard to understand process of like whether or not a property is a good investment based on what you're picking up out of some really historically formed documents. So we're going to be looking at the certificate of title, which sounds like it was made 50 years ago and was made even earlier than that.
Yeah.
And then we'll look at the LIM, which is the Land Information Memorandum, and we'll look at the sale and purchase agreement, which is how you make an offer, and then we'll look at insurance and also the valuation. So there's a solid 5 points we've got to get through today.
Yeah. So let's start off with the review of the certificate of title.
Mm-hmm.
It's one you hear about a lot. No idea what that is oftentimes.
So it's basically a property title which enables you to take ownership of a home. So one of the key things you need to make sure, and normally we'll have a lawyer supporting with this, but is the people that are selling it the people that are the owners. So you actually need to compare the sale and purchase agreement with the certificate of title and make sure that those names match up. You also want to consider, in our earlier episode we spoke about the type of the property. So if they've advertised the property as being freehold, making sure that that is what is shown in the certificate of title, or cross lease, or unit title, whatever that is, that it's matching up with your expectations. And so really, looking at the certificate of title in relation to the sale and purchase and making sure that those details add up.
Yeah, which is an interesting one, right? Because it's not something you often would hear, even when I was buying, like comparing the docs.
Yeah, is
you have a lawyer help with that usually, right? Yeah.
So I guess I did that myself, having had that background. But
lucky you.
But yeah, either you have a lawyer do that for you, but I guess the purpose of this episode is to help you actually it's a tricky one, because obviously there are lawyers that support with the Slice platform and lawyers have their place and they're great, but also trying to help you guys learn so that you can do bits and pieces before engaging someone. Like if you're looking at 8 properties and you want to narrow it down to 2, you can look at bits and pieces yourself and then bring the lawyers in on those that you're serious about. Right. So if you know some of these basic things to look for, that can be a great way to reduce your cost.
Yeah. Going back to that point, what are the other things that you should consider when reviewing, the title documents?
Yeah, another key thing is the location of the boundaries. So understanding, where your neighbour's property is and where your property is, because if you do have plans to develop, or, if you have an expectation that this part of the land is yours and then your neighbour starts using it down the track, and that might impact, how much you're willing to pay, or you need to take that kind of into account. That's something to consider. Yep. The size of the property, which we spoke about, how that can impact value. Normally, if you're in that 100 square metre space, it's not going to make a massive difference, but it definitely does impact the value. But looking at that in relation to what you're therefore willing to pay, and then also any rights and restrictions, and this is a really important one. In fact, in terms of key takeaways, if I can narrow this document down to 2 steps, one is how are you comparing that document to the sale and purchase, is everything kind of stacking up? Just look through it and look for consistency, and if you find an inconsistency, then you need help. And then the second piece would just be the rights and restrictions on that title. So a good example is an easement such as a driveway, which, you know, might provide your neighbour the right to access or use part of your driveway. So any other rights or kind of restrictions on what you can do with the land can impact the value, can impact your use of the land and enjoyment of the land. So really looking to make sure you understand the implications of any of those rights and restrictions. And if you don't, absolutely getting support from a lawyer. But if there's no rights and restrictions there and everything looks, you know, exactly the same, there's no inconsistencies, then you could, you know, do some further due diligence. For example, you could go, oh, well, I'm actually pretty comfortable paying for a building report. So it's all about trying to kind of keep your costs down and get an understanding of what, you know, if you come across something challenging, then you might go, this property has, you know, has some grey area where I'm going to require help. Do I want to proceed with it, or is there another property that I'm actually more interested in anyway that's more straightforward? So it's just trying to catch and do some of that work yourself early on.
No, that's a really good breakdown. So the next document that we should definitely cover is the LIM report, Land Information Memorandum, otherwise known as. Do you want to let us know a little bit, what you should look out for in that particular doc?
Definitely. This document is massive, and it's actually, it's a document that's generated by the council. It's often provided nowadays by an agent, but you can't actually rely or use that document down the line unless you've ordered it yourself for your own purposes.
Interesting. Why is that? No.
It's just like one of those little niggly loopholes, but if you're provided a LIM, you can't rely on it and say, oh, well, it was sold to me on this basis unless you've ordered that LIM yourself. So something to keep in mind, but the absolute trap around that is it often takes 10 days to receive a LIM. And like when in hot markets, which we were looking at, I just had to roll the die.
Speed is everything,
and deal with the LIM. But nowadays, like if you're willing to pay for that and you want to do everything in best practice, like it's pretty awesome to order a LIM, because if there are any challenges, then you can kind of go back to council and say, you know, what happened here, where were the failings. And it's, I think, one of the, gosh, it's such a difficult process, and we always talk about that, but one like feeling of optimism for me in my journey was actually speaking to council on the phone. I don't know if you ever did this.
Oh, no, I didn't.
I would thoroughly recommend calling council. So when you get that
if you can get through to them, or were you able to?
No, you can.
Okay.
You can. Like in this space, like they're actually really good.
Oh, good.
So I think, a key call out would be have a look through that document. And I think it would be a good chance at the end of this episode, like if people want to give feedback, either, you know, sending us an email or through our social channels around whether you'd like some examples of these documents broken down with key tips. Like maybe that would be helpful to get people started, but look at that LIM and then if you have questions or concerns, call council and they can actually do some of that research and that work for you. They're pretty awesome. So you can literally be like, an example would be like, I can see there's like drainage in a manhole down here, a council manhole. Can I build a deck over that? Like that could be a question that you can ask or you need to know. And they sort of see.
And a key one too, if you plan to.
And so I did that for a property. And so I said, you know, and what would be the restrictions be? Because if you've got an idea on what you're going to do with the house, how you're going to improve the value, or even like something that might become costly, like they can actually flesh some of that out for you. The other thing you do want to do, again, as we spoke about the boundaries and understanding them in relation to the certificate of title. Again, it comes back to comparing that document with the LIM. So you can see the boundaries set out there, and you want to understand like where water is draining on the site. Like if you're in a valley and there's like neighbours up here and all of their water and things is travelling down onto your property, you kind of want to know where that water is going, because you know we'll speak about water when we move into building and building reports, but that's a massive thing to understand how that water is travelling, and you know whether or not you're going to have flooding, be it risk of flooding or like and water damage to the property and all of those other things. So it's a massive document, to be honest, and I think if people are keen, we can break it down kind of in a using an exemplar. But just looking through for some of those risks, and then where you identify them, that you can also see geotechnical risks that happen through there. It's not my area, it's actually my partner's area. But
I was like, oh, we're going to get a
yeah, I was
geotechnical.
like, we need another episode of that. But you can actually order the reports that they've done if they've found hazards in terms of like the earth structure. Like we have earthquakes so commonly in New Zealand and all other kind of
natural disasters,
bits and pieces that need to be considered. So you can ask the council for extra information, and without going into all the detail of everything that you'll encounter in that limb, I'd just say, look through that, find out any key hazards or key call-outs. If there's no, on a really basic level, when you look at the site maps, and if there's none of the indicators or the kind of, they have keys and then they have like different dotted lines or lines crossing through the property. If there's very little of that, you're probably in a good place, but just read through all the fine print as well to understand any hazards or risks that the property might be prone to.
It's just came to my mind now. I think when I was looking through a particular limb report, not the property that I own now, but a separate one that I was really serious at buying, or seriously intending to buy, was making sure that any work that's been included in there is compliant, right? Like, did you notice that too when you were purchasing?
So it can be really helpful to give the limb report to your builder as well, so they can look and say, oh, that deck wasn't consented.
Yeah,
and it can get even worse. I know one property that I looked at and I was like, there's a whole floor that wasn't consented.
It's crazy.
They built on top of this building without consent, so how do we know that that's stable? And you can often, if something looks better, like if it's too good to be true, I still think like you got to stand by that. One property that we were looking at, we were like, so there's like 2 levels, it's impeccably furnished, and we could rent out like half the property and live in the other property. And then it turned out they didn't have consent for half of half of the building. So it's not to say that you can't get it, but it's a massive risk.
You take on the risk.
You take on that risk unless you wait for them to show that approval, at which point, if they're going to get that approval, they'll probably charge you more than what you were going to pay for it beforehand. So if it feels like, there's something
Get some
that
advice.
makes you a bit uneasy, then there's probably a reason for that.
Yeah. So we've just done a deep dive into limb reports. Moving on to pretty nitty-gritty one, the sales and purchase agreement. Just give us a breakdown as to what we look in that multi-page document.
Yeah, I think this is a big document as well, in that it's the document you put forward when you're making an offer on the house, or where you're going to auction, which we will talk about in a later episode. But ultimately, the sale and purchase, again, I keep coming back to comparing the documents, and that's kind of an important thing. So understanding, is that, so conversely, we talked about certificate of title, is the sale and purchase matching back up with that? So the land type, the size, the owner. And then the other main things to know in terms of this title, this sale and purchase agreement, are around specific conditions. I think that's like the key takeaway is to look at page X. I can't remember off by heart, but that says specific conditions at the top, and then the seller will actually list any of those conditions that are specific to that property. As a buyer, you want to be checking that out and seeing if there's anything unusual or anything that you're uncomfortable with, or to be honest, anything at all. If there is, then you may need some help, or you'll need to make sure you're comfortable with it. But oftentimes there isn't, and it's just sort of the main page that you need to look at on the document, which sets out, okay, this is the date of settlement. So you're going to be able to move into that house, and you're going to have to put up the cash in a month's time, or whatever that agreed date is. Then there's your subject to conditions area, which we'll speak to as well in another episode, I imagine. But we're looking at, is it subject to finance? Is it subject to the limb report that we spoke about, and that might be a 10-day wait? If it is subject to a building report, how many days are you suggesting for you to complete that? Or is it subject to finance? And finance can be, your ability to get finance, or it could be whether or not you're comfortable with the rates and what the bank is able to offer you. So those are sort of the main conditions we see coming through, and you are able to dictate those, but that is a negotiation. So based on what you provide in the sale and purchase, that is kind of how attractive the seller is going to find that offer. And you can add different conditions as well. So the specific conditions page that I was talking about, that works for the seller and also the buyer. So for me, I spoke about this in an earlier episode, but being such a pauper, I was like, leave the washer in the dryer. And so I added that as a specific condition on that page. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, and I sort of did that myself because I was like, oh, how can I sweeten the deal and play the first home buyer card and everything and do the best that I could. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, don't forget that specific conditions page is also for you, and you have opportunity, particularly in this market, to add, as many obscure conditions as you like.
Yeah.
If they agree to it, they agree to it. But just keep in mind the more conditions that you add, whether they're those on the front page. I know that people don't like subject to finance as a condition because they worry that you're not actually going to get it. But, a LIM or a building report can be a good condition to put in there. Even a building report, if you find something, and honestly, every property tends to have something, but depending on what that is, you may be able to negotiate out of the contract if you're unhappy, and also you may be able to negotiate or change the price based on what happens there. So you could technically, you could technically put, and I've done this, a larger kind of offer amount on that contract to get across the line. Also, if there's a multi-party offer, like you talked about price by negotiation and having to compete with other people, this is just quite controversial. I'm like a little uncomfortable talking about it, but you could in theory put a larger number down on that contract, and then you could get a building report, find fault with the building and renegotiate that price, at which point
very tricky.
It's a little bit sneaky, but at which point the seller, has gone down that journey with you, and they probably want to close. And if you have found something in that building report, that is, a valid reason to say, well, I need to take 40 grand off or whatever it might be. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, they're playing their game, and the buyers need to play theirs. So,
and we're paying a huge astronomical.
Yeah, we're here for the buyers, so it is what it is. But that, I think it's important to remember how you can use those conditions. And also doing things like, we'll talk about some of those strategies probably in the making an offer and auctions episode that we do later. But I think that's a key thing with the sale and purchase, but you're looking very much at the first page, and then whatever page number it is that has the specific conditions on, to see what they've got and consider what you want to put on it. And you're comparing that document with the certificate of title. So there's kind of 3 key takeaways, I think, for that document.
Nice. Awesome. So another key piece, though, particularly comes into play when you're getting really serious, when you purchase the property, so to speak, is home insurance and getting the quote evaluation on that, which was pretty daunting process for me personally, in terms of, if your house catches on fire, how much is the bank going to, pay essentially, or whoever your insurance provider is?
Yeah, absolutely. And most people won't know this, but insurance is actually a requirement from the lender. So when a bank lends to you, they need to know that the property is really insurable. So before you make an offer or go to auction, you ideally want to get a quote for insurance to say, yes, we're actually willing to insure this. So to do that in New Zealand, you can go on Core Logic, and you can you can just fill out a form that's for Sum Insure. And that kind of gives you an idea of how much the property would cost to rebuild from scratch, say it lit up in flames.
I think I use that.
Yeah, it's the common kind of practice in New Zealand. So you complete that, and then you get a quote from either your bank or insurer, just to make sure that that's going to be able to go ahead, because they won't lend if the property isn't insurable, and then you could be in a sticky situation. And the other document or kind of process to get familiar with around that is the valuation. It is kind of a document, but it's provided by the bank or sometimes your broker as a valuation of that property. And what's important to note there is you generally can't pay more than a certain amount and receive that lending from the bank. So they give you an upper limit on that, and they say you can't offer, whether that's
capped.
You can't offer more than 950,000 on this property because of the perceived value of said property. It's a really tricky one though, because these valuations are notoriously,
Moderate?
some of them good, some of them not so good. The data is like getting better and better, but it's a hard one to know. So if you've done all of your other due diligence and you believe it's a sound investment, sometimes I think don't lean into that figure so much.
Yeah, really good point.
But in saying that, if it's your first home, there's a confidence issue that comes with that, and you might just want to purchase something at a level that, reflects that. Equally in this market though, you might think, well, I'm going to try and underpay on what the recommended kind of mid band is for that price. But essentially you need to get that valuation before you put in an offer, because unless you are buying the house, I just thought, we've never spoken about this, and it's probably because it's not really an option, but unless you're kind of buying that house with outright $1 million that you have and you're not taking on bank lending.
Lucky you.
Yeah, that's epic. Probably the wrong podcast though, because you don't need us.
Not listening to us. Yeah, fine.
But if you're taking that lending on and you're purchasing a property, you need to stick within the bands that they give you in that valuation. So before you make an offer, or before you, God forbid, go to auction, and this does happen sometimes, like people go to auction, put an arbitrary number out there, and then the bank doesn't want to lend them for that amount because they haven't kind of followed the journey. But that's why we're here, obviously, is to break down these steps and make sure you have all the information you need before making that offer. But that's probably the final document of those 5 that you need to look through and understand before you even move into making an offer or going through the auction process.
Right, perfect. So what would be your sort of final piece of advice in terms of how to best prioritise all these different, key pieces of documentation that you need to wrap your head around? What would be your, just final golden nugget?
I think it's what we're doing on this podcast is talking about those documents so that it can be a bit less scary and people can get some confidence around how to manage them. But I think for me it was challenging because these tasks had to occur for every property that I explored, and I wasn't successful on every property that I explored. So it's more just actually the understanding of there are 9 things to do before I put an offer in. So just listen to this podcast, and as you're going through it again, listen again, and then jump onto the Slice platform, and it's set out. So there's just a checklist. It's just a checklist, and it says, look at the certificate of title, look at the sale and purchase, these things that we've talked about today, and then go and make an offer or go to auction. So it just breaks that down, and each time it's under the find property section of the platform in the dashboard. Each time you're considering a property, just go tick, 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 tick. We've done all of that. This property, based on the documentation, is a good investment. Therefore, I'm now willing to do a building report. Or, I'm now willing to start spending money on the due diligence for this property. But ideally, if you can do some of that work first, you can save money and, just get really methodical.
Yeah, I think
methodical.
I think we just
I battled with that.
Yeah.
Methodical. Get very methodical about it, because it's not.
You know what she's trying to say, guys.
Come on, you're being very hard on me.
Yeah.
But if you can just go through, and just do 9 steps, and it is a few for these documents. But if you know what you have to do and you can just look for those key things, then you can engage the partners to support with your paid due diligence once you've got a few properties that you're seriously interested in pursuing.
Awesome. No, thanks, Amy. I'm looking forward to the next one after, that was a pretty heavy one to be fair, but we're looking at property versus stocks from an investment perspective.
Yeah, I'm pretty pumped about that topic because I feel
like you have a certain angle here or a certain side you're on.
I think it's not one or other, and we'll get into the detail there, but there's a lot of education in the stock space at the moment, which is amazing. And it's super interesting to look at, how that strategy kind of moves into the property strategy and what the pros and cons are. So looking forward to it.
See you then.
Thank you for joining our community. Buying property isn't easy, but listening in will get you one step closer on your journey. Please leave an Apple or Spotify review and provide feedback so we can improve your experience. Join our Facebook group, A Safe Space to Learn Together, or follow us on Instagram at Slice2Buy. If you have any questions or topics you would like us to touch on, you can email us at hello@slice2buy.com. A quick reminder, Slice the podcast does not provide personalised investment advice. We are not acting as financial advisors or taking into account your circumstances. To get personalised advice, join us at slicetobuy.com and engage with our partners who can act as your financial advisor or lawyer and support you with your specific needs.